15% of all imports are used by the construction industry, right? So I think that number is 469 billion.
Yeah.
Steel represents 163 billion of that.
Well, steel and other metals. So like steel, aluminum, copper, tin, other stuff. So steel and metal in general. And again, not all that's not exclusively used by the construction industry, obviously, but it's used by the construction industry is a major consumer of those things. I think construction is something like 6 or 7% of GDP. So it's, a greater than a fraction of the industry is as GDP. But then, of course, not all this stuff is used exclusively by construction industry. So if you took a wild guess and said, okay, assume half of this stuff is used by the construction industry and half of these used by other industries, then you would get, 7.5%, which is, I think, pretty close to the fraction of it is as GDP.
So would relatively small share of imports, I think 31 billion was the number you had in your article. One of my surprising takeaways was that that number is relatively small given how much we've heard the media talk about it.
Yeah, that was a kind of high level takeaway I had as well. The stuff that there seems to be something of a misalignment or a disconnect between the stuff that gets attention and like the dollar value of it. And there may be other reasons beyond just dollar value that people are consider it important for various reasons. But yeah, there's like $31 billion of wood. It gets a huge amount of attention. But there's, $18 billion worth of air conditioning equipment, but that doesn't get that much attention. There's almost $30 billion worth of construction machinery, and that doesn't get that much, attention. So I don't have an amazingly good model in my head. And if to go with steel and metal, steel gets a reasonably high amount of like attention. People are always, complaining about like, steel imports and blah, blah, blah. But with aluminum is the imports, the imports are pretty close to as high, if not higher. And they're a much larger fraction of like, there's much more foreign imports compared to domestic production of aluminum than there is with steel. We actually make a lot of steel. And that may be because, the steel industry union or, the steel unions or organization is like more powerful than the sort of aluminum fabricators. I don't have a great model of that, but yeah, in general, the stuff, the big dollar item stuff is not necessarily the stuff that gets the most attention.
Out of curiosity, did you see the National Home Builders Association letter? Did you read that?
Yeah, I think I read it. They were concerned about wood and they were concerned about drywall.
Yeah.
And drywall is another one where it's like, I don't understand why anyone would care about this at all, because the absolute numbers are very, very small. And the fraction of it compared to like domestic production seems to be quite small. As far as I can tell, the vast majority of drywall is made in the US, which makes sense because it's bulky and low value, and it doesn't make sense economically to transport it very far. So I'm not quite sure that the only reason it makes sense is just the NAHB is in general, one of the main things that they do is try to like keep the cost of building a new home down. That's one of their big areas of focus, perhaps their biggest area of focus. And so anything that they think threatens that, they're very strongly against. And this shows up in a whole bunch of ways. They have fought very hard against like code requirements to like mandate fire sprinklers in single family homes, basically essentially on cost grounds. Which is why we don't have fire sprinklers in single family homes, basically, because it is in the building code. They have sort of been able to sort of get states to revoke that requirement. But yeah, so they very strongly advocate against that. And I get the sense that their advocacy is maybe not amazingly connected to sort of the market size of the import or whatever. They think it's going to have a cost impact on new home construction. They're going to be fervently against it, or at least that's my rough model.
Fascinating. So I was actually going to pull, if you don't mind, I was going to pull up the categories. I have the image. So yeah, I mean, I think this graphic does a good job of just telling the story on one, the large buckets, and two, what is making up the biggest components of each of those categories and buckets. But yeah, do you want to highlight anything in particular here that jumped out at you?
yeah, the size of steel and metal is very large. Um, the size of tools is quite large. This is another one that doesn't get all that much attention, but we import a lot of construction machinery. We import a lot of power tools. We make very few power tools in the US. We import a lot of the stuff that goes on the inside of your home. We import a lot of. So that's like, appliances, both like small little ones and kind of bigger ones like refrigerators, you know, small electronic devices, little wiring devices, outlets and switches and stuff. That stuff is kind of all like imported. Lighting equipment is very heavily imported. Stuff like curtains and rugs and looms and stuff like that is all really important. I think that's one reason why people have the sense of, oh gosh, everything is just made in China these days. We must not make anything in the US. Then you go and look at the numbers and like China is a lot of imports, but it's like, 15% of imports for something by dollar value. And possibly one of the reasons for that perception is because so much of the stuff that's on the inside of our home and that we use and interact with and actually spend money on is the stuff that comes from China. But if you start to kind of look at other things, the Chinese imports are much, or perhaps much less dominant. So I thought, yeah, that was kind of interesting. And then just, the hot, how much of this, there's not that much stuff that is like, we make almost none of it in the US. It's kind of like these stuff like appliances, stuff like power tools, these kind of like small and reasonably complex manufactured goods. But then there's also not that much stuff that we make almost entirely in the US. There's very few things that are like single digit import fractions or whatever. And it's like, that's like really, really good stuff, like, concrete block and stuff like that, for just makes zero sense to import it. Most of the stuff is kind of in the middle where it's like, it's a big, but maybe not overwhelming fraction. Which is just basically just to say that the, construction industry is, the inputs to it are highly globalized. We kind of source the stuff that we need kind of from everywhere. It's a big globalized world, and construction is not immune from that.
I'm going to show the country graphic now. I have a few questions on that. Yeah, I mean, overall, related to, so your exercise was, let's first categorize and form a methodology to make sense of the, overall costs related to construction and the big buckets and labels that, we put around that, find absolute numbers for those things. And then you did it on a country by country basis and highlighted, the countries that potentially are going to be impacted by the proposed tariffs, China, Canada, Mexico, being a few examples. But yeah, overall, as I pull up the graphic, when you did a country by country analysis, what jumped out at you?
Yeah, this is, again, it was interesting to see how the breakdown was and what major stuff came from where. And so I had this very rough model in my head where, China, Southeast Asia, places like that, a big advantage is like low labor costs. That's a lot less true than it used to be, but it's still true, especially in comparison to the US. But that comes with the trade-off of like very long shipping distances. And so there's gonna be advantage to things that are like small and relatively high value, or, you can like fit a lot of it in a shipping container and truck it across the Pacific Ocean, and it's valuable to do that. So like, these like small, higher value manufactured goods, you see a lot of that coming from China. And in a place like Canada, it's kind of like the opposite, where you have much, much higher labor costs, but it's much, much closer. So this shipping distance is not nearly so burdensome. And so from there, you will tend to see stuff like heavier, bulky stuff that maybe doesn't make sense to ship long distances, but maybe can be produced in like a really efficient, factory, like sort of like chemicals and steel and metal or something, where it doesn't necessarily take a lot of labor to sort of produce that stuff, but you don't want to have to transport it long distances. And then Mexico is you kind of have both those benefits. You kind of have the benefit of, the benefit of proximity where your shipping distances aren't so high, but then you also have the benefit of labor is much cheaper for you. So I kind of see a mix there of, both sort of like bulkier stuff, both kind of in like raw materials, but also stuff like air handling units, air conditioners, which are sort of big and bulky. And then also sort of kind of more like manufactured goods. There's a decent number of appliances there, large appliances, small appliances, I think, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it was kind of interesting to see that this sort of simple model I have in my head kind of reveal itself into how these sort of imports are distributed by country.
Yeah. So for China in particular, 89 billion in total imports as the absolute value. The contents were, that you just alluded to were somewhat unique, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that's like, some of the takeaways on the country by country analysis were correct. Like Canada, for instance, which is what I wanted to ask you about in a second. 20% US imports 20% of metal and 50% of wood from Canada. And so, but that's like the public perception. That was like actually true when you did the research. With China in particular, yeah, just you alluded to it, but can you cover exactly what maybe what the surprises were, that the takeaways for China, China in particular, and why it surprised you?
Yeah, but so this is like another one. I think there's a perception that like, anything that's like any import that's like cheap or feels threatening to the US is coming from China and is, taking advantage of like some combination of their just, low labor costs, or they're like sort of this, more broadly, this like enormous manufacturing engine they have, that like anything that can be manufactured cheaply, China is the one that knows how to do that. And for stuff, again, for stuff like appliances, that is to some extent true. But for stuff, people also, I think it's true for stuff like, steel or stuff like drywall or stuff like that. And a really, really, really small fraction of those, these sort of big bulk materials are coming from China. It's really these sort of more processed, more manufactured goods that make up the lion's share of our, Chinese construction related imports.
So, back to Canada, should we, as a construction industry, be fearful about the cost of those inputs going up if there's a tariff in place?
I mean, yeah, this is another area where I sort of, I said before, I'm not an economist. This is an area where you would want like an economist, right? Because it's like actually trying to figure out the downstream consequences of that stuff is very difficult. It's not, amazingly obvious what like, what the elasticity of this stuff is and how much does a change in price, or, how much can people, substitute it for other things. And that was all the stuff I just, I basically went, it's like, this is going to be very complicated to figure out. I'm not equipped with the tools to do it. I am not going to try to do it. But yeah, very straightforwardly, if you make things imports more expensive, it is going to drive up the price of other things. I think we already saw that with some of the steel stuff where you're seeing like maybe domestic producers raise prices. Yeah. And it's the question is how much, and not amazingly straightforward to figure out.
Yeah.
You can expect that's what will happen.
The natural progression of this conversation in the industry is, a reshoring conversation. Production of materials, basically all the inputs we're talking about. And I'm curious, like, as you went down this rabbit hole with tariffs, kind of where your head went there, like practicality, where you would start first if you were implementing a reshoring effort specifically for the industry.
Sure. So my basic model of that, and again, I'm not an economist, so this is a simple model that I don't necessarily have like amazingly high confidence in. But my basic model of this is that, basically tariffs inflict a cost on you. It makes whatever you're tariffing more expensive. The question is whether the cost is worth it. And a lot of times what seems to happen is that the cost you pay is very, very high, and the benefit that you get from it is maybe a lot lower than the cost. I think I looked at this recently. I think with these steel tariffs, like earlier steel tariffs, like 2018 steel tariffs, I want to say, Um, and I think there was analysis that basically showed like you know, the benefits of that, we it, like increased employment by like 1,000, or something like that. But because steel is like an input to so many other industries, the downstream and it raised the price of steel for all these other guys. The downstream consequences of it were like for like 1,000 jobs gained in the steel industry, there were like 75,000 jobs lost in other industries because it was so, this thing was like so distortionary. And I think you kind of saw something similar. There was, I saw something else about like washing machine tariffs, where it just made washing machines much more expensive, and it created a small number of jobs. Each one of those jobs, basically, if you work out like how much, cost was inflicted per job, it was something like each job cost like on the order of like $800,000 or something to sort of save, basically. So again, it's not, you're not necessarily getting no benefits out of it. It's just you're paying a very, very dear price for them, basically. And so you have to decide, when is it kind of worth it to kind of do that? Um, and I think roughly, there's a few situations where it's worth it to do it. If something is like a critical national defense item, you want to be able to make sure you maintain the capability to produce it in the U.S. If you have like a nascent industry that you're like trying to sort of protect and support in the very early stages, you kind of want to do that. So I think a lot of what these like Southeast Asian countries like Japan and Korea, I think they did, when they were building up their sort of industries, I believe they did sort of things like that. Again, not an economist, so I may be wrong about that, not an expert. But just like these random broad tariffs that aren't targeted to sort of protect or develop certain industries, or, I think the case for that is quite a bit more difficult to make. And I think that, the sort of I think it's very likely the benefits you're getting, getting are probably quite heavily outweighed by the cost of them.
You didn't write about this or address this in your article, but the other really topical conversation related to construction costs right now is related to labor, just construction labor inputs. Given the overall shortage we're experiencing as an industry, and then with potential immigration policy coming into play, with the retirement of the current generation of frontline construction workers, it's a pretty nasty cocktail.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, and like, from a like short term and then maybe a long term perspective?
Yeah. So I get, I don't have amazingly, you know, coalesce thoughts, about this, but yeah, basically kind of, I think what you said are all the sort of worrying factors here is that, you can't again, any person who's like managing a major construction project or, works in this industry is constantly talking about how difficult it is getting to like find the labor, right? And how, the workforce is aging and, these people are exiting and retiring, and we don't have the sort of people that are in need to replace them. And yeah, construction, I haven't looked into this deeply, but I suspect that it's like on the very high end of like, industries that rely on these, immigrant labor, and how much of a threat is going to be to sort of a more stringent immigration policy that is like interested in like sort of deporting people. I don't know, but I suspect it's, like you said, it's not going to be nothing. I suspect it could be significant. I think this is, it's hard to tell. This may be balanced to some extent. If we see like a downturn in home building, or a broader economic downturn or whatever, I think there's a little bit of evidence that some of these like big southern markets, I think they're starting to turn, is my sense. So, it's obviously going to be influenced by like the sort of larger home building picture, more broadly. But yeah, I suspect it's going to be kind of difficult, and, going to kind of keep driving those prices up. Maybe it will sort of incentivize a search for like less. I would be a little bit surprised if it did, just because these costs, and if, even if it drives costs up, costs have been going up for like decades or whatever, and it doesn't seem to have done that previously. So I would be a little bit surprised. All this was the thing. Oh, now it's so expensive that we need to sort of invest in this technology. But it would be good if they did.
It's a certainly a fair comment to make. And for people who are watching who don't know your background, you spent a good amount of time with Katera, which is like maybe the most famous example uh, of a company that pursued a drastically different construction method. Um, I'm curious, like, yeah, like I don't want to spend a ton of time on Katera in particular, but what's preventing some construction methods, some alternative construction methods from potentially having a gaining a greater share of adoption right now? Like, yeah, with that, with the sequence of events that are occurring, like one would think, not only is it the cost inputs for construction are going up, but interest rates are
Hmm.
higher than they've been in quite a bit of time. The incentive should be like, hey, if we can build cheaper with these new systems, it might require a greater capex expense right now. Might be a longer term investment, but theoretically over time, like we should be able to eat into those costs and produce a better product, be more precise, all the promises of automation. Like why hasn't that happened? And what would be what would be the reasons that you would say as of like in 2025 why that wouldn't happen in the short term?
Sure. So at a very high level, I would say the reason is the sort of benefits that you have traditionally been able to see from that sort of technology development have not really been worth it to make the investments to kind of do it. And so, I worked at Katera, which was sort of a prefabricated uh, housing company, and this is in an area where you kind of technology that people continue to have a lot of enthusiasm for, but you kind of see it over and over again. People have this idea in their heads that if you could like build houses the way you build cars, you could become sort of the Henry Ford construction basically and build this stuff so much cheaper than it's possible to build by hand. And it doesn't really ever quite work. There's a few caveats to that, but in general, building stuff in a factory is not really substantially cheaper than just sort of building it on site. Um, so the benefits to sort of doing this sort of factory methods just are worth it, are a lot of times are not worth it to sort of invest the cost in building the huge facilities and to continue to operate them even in downturns. That's one thing that you see is when you do sort of see these prefabricators or whatever pop up, when there's a big downturn in housing, they all kind of go out of business and they don't necessarily come back once housing comes back. That's kind of what happened in 2008. But that's kind of just a little bit true more broadly, is that the benefits from a lot of this technology have not been seen perceived as to being worth the sort of investment and risk that you take with sort of implementing them.
One of the areas that we have some hope and optimism around is on-site, on-site prefab. So basically like plugging in, robots actually on-site. You don't need a big overhead of a factory. You don't have to, gauge some of you don't have to have a steady flow of demand in order to support the cost of the factory.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting work being done in that I'm like cautiously more optimistic about. So yeah, like you said, there's a lot of interest in like, maybe we don't need a big centralized factory. Can we set up this like, smaller, more mobile, less, decentralized factory or micro factory or something like that? Is either like close to the job site or sort of a more regional operation, with like, we set up this sort of flexible production equipment. So yeah, like exactly like you said, that you sort of get a lot of these benefits from this automation, but you don't need to have like an enormous volume or huge spending to sort of get it. You're seeing kind of people sort of start to chip away at like job site automation. There's like a little bit of a steady stream of, oh, we built a robot do like this specific narrow task and it can do it. It only does this like one thing, but it can like do it pretty well. And I only expect that sort of thing to get better and easier to do and cheaper as sort of automation technology kind of continues to get better. And then of course, it's hard to say how enthusiastic you should be about this stuff, but there's such an enormous amount of money going into like humanoid robots and adapting, AI, LLM technology into sort of moving robots around in the real world. And there's a lot of difficulties with that. People, automation folks are constantly pointing out how sort of dumb and complex it is to make a humanoid robot when you can build like a purpose-built machine to do any
Yeah.
given task much more cheaply and much easier. But the idea of the humanoid robot is like, okay, you can do this like really flexible thing. It can go
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
a person can do. And if you could get that sort of technology working, or even in relatively limited domain, that could potentially be a big benefit of it as well. And that seems like a very, very hard problem to me. But there's such an enormous amount of like effort and money going into it that I think there's like a reasonable chance we'll see pretty good progress on it.
I like it. We've seen a few iterations of humanoids trying to enter the construction market, and there's obviously a different form factor that you would need for construction. Like you need high durability, a rugged,
Yeah.
a rugged robot. Like if you've seen the Tesla humanoids, like probably
Yeah.
is not going to survive a
Yeah.
construction site.
The stuff that I've seen seems like pretty far from that. It seems like, okay, if we set it up in this they're like very, very early pilot programs and like factories with like really constrained operations. And you look at it and it's like, well, this thing can barely do anything at all. So it seems pretty far from like being able to like navigate a job site. But
But I
again,
do, yeah, but I do think what you mentioned is correct. Like the reason to be excited and to take the rational optimist approach is because you can stack value. There's multiple use cases potentially for that humanoid form factor than it is for that purpose specific robot that can only drywall, that can only do one specific task. And if over time as the technology improves, they can do material handling, they can do different computer vision elements and real time job site footage and for security purposes, et cetera. So like you can stack these things over time, and then it's like the value becomes somewhat obvious. Whereas the purpose built value may be somewhat debatable depending on your job cost input for human labor.
yeah,
It can be incremental there, which versus the over time a humanoid robot could be like a very obvious ROI cost benefit.
yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see is sort of, the big question I think is underappreciated in sort of technology development and where is technology going is how fast various things improve and whatever get to a first approximation, whatever gets better the fastest is going to win.
Mm-hmm.
So one kind of example of this is with solar energy. If you look like 10 or 15 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, a big solar thing people were enthusiastic about it was like thermal solar, where you basically have a bunch of mirrors and they heat up a big, there's a tower with like water on it, and they heat up the water, and that turns into steam and drives a turbine. And that technology, people were kind of enthusiastic about it. It continued to get better. It actually continues to get better, but solar photovoltaic got better so much faster that these investments now no longer make sense. And so people are kind of abandoning these things in favor of solar PV because the economics of it, if solar PV has just gotten so much better, so much cheaper, that it doesn't make sense to kind of do this other technology that that managed to kind of still kind of improve. And so I think the question with like automation is what's going to get better? Is it like, are these humanoids and these like really flexible solutions going to like improve on a, are they going to improve like really, really fast? And then you're not going to want these like special purpose robots because you can just get a flexible thing that does everything you need, for much or cheaper or cheap enough, just kind of like, multi-purpose microprocessors took over like special purpose processors basically. Or are you going to see it, it ends, the technology evolves in such a way where it's like, you can get a basic, you can get a sort of a couple of different simple form factors, with a simple arm or something, simple like wheeled robot or something like that, and easily program it to kind of do different things. And it's going to be much easier to have like a fleet of cheap special purpose robots than, a humanoid that can be flexibly do any task. I don't know. It's not obvious to me which if any of those what those improvement trajectories are going to look like. But I think we are going to see like improvement along those lines, and I think it's so it'll be interesting to see how it sort of shakes out.
I digress. We drifted away from the tariffs article. I wanted to put some
We did.
closure around that for people. So I just wrote down a few kind of notable takeaways that I had.
Mhm.
Let me just read a couple of these to you and make sure that I passed the quiz. So yeah, notable and like surprising findings. So furniture had a really heavy import share, which I
Yeah.
think was counterintuitive.
I was very surprised by that. I mean, I guess not amazingly surprised if if you order something from Wayfair and you look at the box, it says it's from China, so or Vietnam, something like that. So I shouldn't have been that surprised, but still,
But like, bulky, low cost,
yeah.
like
I confess I don't 100% understand how the economics of that work. I would love to learn about it if someone happened to know, but I don't. That's still sort of like, huh, that's still surprising to me.
another takeaway. So high import reliance for heavy items. So products that are, large or costly to ship, appliances, structural steel, machinery, HVAC units, etc. Like pretty high import
Yeah,
cost for
quite.
those
Yeah,
things.
yeah, quite a few of those things. Construction machinery is not as surprising to me because I imagine the stuff is like pretty expensive. So dollars per volume per unit volume or something. Maybe the number is actually not that high. That would be interesting to look at. Uh, but it does kind of surprise me that Japan and Germany are so dominant there. And China is like comparatively less, less dominant. Yeah, so that would be interesting to think to understand more about how that industry evolved.
Wood and drywall fears were overstated by the media was another takeaway I had. So
Yeah, drywall, yeah, in particular, but wood, and that's maybe just, I'm not sure if any individual article is like wrong or something. It's just interesting, like, so the attention that it gets. So maybe not fears are overstated, but like the amount of attention is maybe disproportionate to the dollar value.
China doesn't actually supply much raw steel and wood.
Yeah.
That's another takeaway.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Pretty diversified input sources overall. Like no single country dominates U.S. construction imports.
Yeah, it's all this stuff kind of, again, if you look through like a giant table of all these sort of cross references, you can find a couple places like, oh, this thing, 50% of it comes from this one country, this small category, 50% of it comes from this one company, or this one country. And I'm sure if you went like even more granular, you could find, oh, this one type of valve, this all comes from like these two companies and they're both in China or something like that. But in general, this stuff kind of comes from everywhere. Yeah.
This is like a super granular one. This is my last point. This is, I mean, may not be that big of a deal, but like Germany is a significant metal supplier. I just didn't know that.
I was kind of a little bit surprised by that. I mean, they have a pretty big. I know they have like a decent like steel industry. I haven't looked into it deeply. I assume the steel import categories are kind of weird because it includes like just fairly like raw stuff from the mill, but it actually also includes like these more processed shapes and stuff like that. So I don't have a 100%. I don't 100% understand like what specifically we're getting from Germany, but yeah, I don't. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, why Germany is so high and what specifically we're getting from them.
Yeah. Any other key points that I missed that you would add?
Not really, again, this was whatever, yeah, kind of what everybody would like to know is like, well, how much is this going to make prices go up? And sort of, I was not able to sort of, that would be a very hard, much harder to answer. And I did not feel equipped to tackle it, but this sort of gives you a greater understanding of the lay of the land. So
Macroeconomics would be very easy if we could predict all of those, the millions of downstream consequences of the
yeah,
complex system. to transition from the Tariffs article for a second, I was curious, like, in your body of work, like looking at your archive, what were the most fun articles that you have written?
Oh, this is a good question. The most fun for me are when I feel like I'm able to sort of learn something and sort of also articulate something that I don't think is either known at all or maybe not really, really widely known. So I was just reading one this morning. Because I'm working on a piece about not about construction, about jet engines. And I wrote a previous one about why all of a sudden in sort of starting in kind of the late 80s, 90s, gas turbine power became really, really popular. And kind of came out of nowhere. And now it's like a very, very, very large fraction of the US energy supply. And I was able to kind of figure out there's specific technical reasons why it took that long for it to kind of show up. And I don't think it's a thing that's written down anywhere, but because I was able to sort of get research and understand how this technology works enough, again, I'm not like an expert on that stuff to kind of figure it out. I was able to sort of think, oh, this is why it took so long. And it was able to sort of explain that in a way that I think makes sense. And sort of that stuff where it's like, I'm able to learn something and I'm able to sort of figure out something that is not generally known either beyond like a really, really narrow niche or maybe known at all. Maybe I'm the first one to sort of figure it out or at least articulate it. Those are the things that are sort of and most fun to write. So a lot of the construction cost stuff falls under that category too, but anything kind of, in that domain. And the recent one that I wrote about why sort of the postmodernist aesthetic or the modernist aesthetic, excuse me, became so popular with like skyscrapers, I think is another one in that category where I was able to kind of research enough and kind of figure out these mechanics and demonstrate the evidence for it to sort of show why I think this thing is correct. And that was not something that I quite understood before I started. And I don't think it was like really known generally. So I was able, building, adding a brick to the sort of big tower of human knowledge is always valuable to me. And
Another Substack writer that I follow, Packy McCormick, maybe you know him.
Yeah.
He refers to you as the goat.
Right.
And I think a lot of what you described is why he refers to you that way, simply just like you're writing stuff and researching stuff that has never been done before. No one's ever answered some of those questions. And so thank you for doing that. I mean, it's extremely helpful as an investor and just generally as someone who also likes to learn. I appreciate the time you put into it.
I love being able to do it. So I'm happy to.
I think that's pretty much all I had. Thanks, Brian.
Well, yeah.